I have to admit, I've never been into Warhammer 40k. It's one of those franchises that's just way too big, too bold, and honestly just too depressing for my tastes. But then I played Space Marine 2, and let me tell you, brother,
The heretics must be purged.
suffice it to say that Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 has finally made me interested in the universe of 40k. And today I would just like to talk a little bit about this gem of a game. And so first I'll go over some of the game, some of the things that I liked, some of the things that I didn't like, how the game has been received so far, and a couple of other things as well. So first of all, you might be wondering, hey, what is Space Marine 2? What is this game? Well, you play as Titus, who is the previous protagonist of the first Space Marine game, and I'm not going to tell you how or why, but he's back again, and he's once again the protagonist fighting against hordes of Xenos and heretics. And for the main campaign, he has 2 other Space Marines on his squad. More on that later. First of all, we gotta talk about the gameplay because that is really Space Marine 2's main selling point here, and I think a lot of people are looking at this game specifically because of the combat. The combat is really fun. And now I'm saying this after having played through the campaign first. I didn't do any multiplayer before the main campaign. I just played it right through and I finished it in around 10 hours or so. I think 9 or 10 hours is roughly the time it took for me to complete the campaign on normal mode. And saying that, normal mode is actually pretty challenging. I didn't think that this game would be as difficult on just the most regular difficulty level, but there are some enemy types in here that are, if not annoying, just a little bit complicated to deal with, and there are definitely objectives here and there that are not annoying again, but it's just before you reach annoying, it's like a little frustrating at times, but there needs to be some form of challenge to the game, right? I'll be honest, I'm kind of afraid to approach any of the other difficulty levels, like above this, like veteran or the last difficulty level. I don't remember the name of it, but yeah, this game can be unforgiving at times. Partly this is due to the movement of the game because you're playing as a Space Marine, right? You're just a big walking tank essentially, and so you're kind of sluggish or a little bit slow. It's not to the degree where it becomes again annoying or anything because you are a Space Marine. You're supposed to be this big hulking demigod of a man, and so it makes sense because you're just stomping into hordes of enemies that are just overrunning you all over the place from all sides, and you're just swinging your sword, swinging your hammer, or whatever you have at hand. And you're just demolishing, just terrifying foes and monstrosities. And I really like the fact that they've managed to make the Space Marines feel like absolute badasses. Like these are the best of the best, the top brass soldiers, and they really make you feel that way. There are moments where you just run into regular foot soldiers here and there, just regular ass NPCs, and they literally go down on their knees for you because they worship the Space Marines. It's an epic feeling, I'm not gonna lie. It's badass. And so as somebody who's like getting exposed to Warhammer 40k in this way the first time for real, it's really an experience to see it like from a third person perspective, like watching Titus being like this sort of demigod that's presented to the average folks. It's just really cool. Now, as a Space Marine, you have access to a bunch of various weapons, and you unlock these as you progress through the main campaign. If you're doing the main campaign, that is, because you can do operations and PvP aside from that. You don't specifically have to do the main campaign first. But in any case, there are like a slew of weapons here. There are the standard bolt weapons, there are sniper rifles, there are laser sniper rifles, and if you want to go the melee route, you can pick between a fast knife or a, chainsaw sword. There's the power sword, and then there's this big hammer that you can use to essentially clear enemies really effectively. It's super satisfying to use. Basically every weapon is fun to use, and thankfully because the campaign isn't very long, it never gets too repetitive even if you're fighting swaths of enemies over and over again. And while it seems like there's no variety in maybe some of the gameplay you've seen, there definitely is later on in the game. Obviously I'm not gonna say any story spoilers here, but yeah, there is more variety than it might look like. And when it comes to destroying hordes of enemies, variety really is important in order to make it feel like it's not just repetitive and just the same thing over and over again, because that's an easy trap that a lot of games fall into. One thing that helps with this is that, of course, Space Marine 2 has a bunch of different finishing moves, and I'm all for finishing moves in my action games. And depending on what weapon you're using, like what melee weapon you're using, you do different attacks, and depending on the enemy types, you do different finisher animations for those enemies. And so the game still finds a way to keep you interested in terms of combat. It's not just shooting your enemies and just getting headshots and just clearing waves with your guns. It's actually much more fun to just, go on a complete finisher killing spree. And there are even some moments here that are like comparable to God of War, where you literally destroying an enemy bit by bit, ripping their arms off, their legs, their heads. It's gruesome. It's absolutely satisfying. The sound design is really, really good, and it feels super crunchy and it feels super heavy. And they've really nailed the feeling of being a Space Marine. Now, while we were speaking a little bit about the story and the pacing of the game, I didn't expect the plot to be very intriguing, but it's actually more intriguing than you might expect. There is some drama involved, and I very much enjoyed that because I thought that the whole campaign was just going to be you fighting against enemies. But there is some more stuff going on behind the scenes. It's simple, but it's still interesting. And whenever I felt like the gameplay became a little bit too stale or repetitive, I was instantly reminded of the story, and it kept me going. Now, I briefly mentioned multiplayer, and there is operations, and then there is PvP. Now, I'm not a big PvP guy myself anymore, but I've played a bunch of operations, and operations is pretty much co-op, and you're taking on missions and objectives that you see in the main story, but since you're playing as Titus in the main story, you don't actually do those objectives. You just hear about them from another squad. Now, in operations, you play as one of those squads and you get different objectives. So even if it's the same map, you face different bosses and you do different objectives. And so again, it's like really refreshing to play through the operations if you play through the main story, because it's actually different to what you experienced in the main plot. And of course, you're not playing as Titus. You can choose to play as various other characters and classes. And these classes have their own special abilities and their special ultimate attacks, I guess you could say. My favorite right now is the Vanguard, that essentially has a grappling hook that they can shoot towards an enemy, pull themselves to the enemy, and then kick him in the face. It's super fun, it's super gratifying, and you're always feeling like you're in the midst of battle whenever you're playing as a Vanguard, and it's just a complete bloodbath, and I just absolutely love it. Now, Operations is really interesting because it very much reminds me of the Mass Effect 3 campaign, or the Mass Effect 3 multiplayer campaign, where you're essentially doing a bunch of different objectives across the galaxy while Commander Shepard is collecting allies and, well, doing the main story in Mass Effect 3. Because again, you're dealing with other objectives while the main story is happening, so it's still a part of the story, which is really cool. I appreciate that. It makes the world feel much more alive and the universe feel more immersive, because you're essentially hearing about the exploits you just did a couple of hours ago in the main plot. And now you're playing as one of the soldiers or the Space Marines that made that objective happen, or you get what I'm saying. Okay, so now that I've gone over most of the good stuff, let's talk about some of the bad stuff. And actually, there's pretty much just one bad thing about this game that I can think of, and it's not necessarily about the game itself. Unfortunately, Saber Interactive and Focus Entertainment decided to do the, well, greedy thing and push out the game early to anyone who ordered the special editions for Space Marine 2. Because the game was supposed to release on the 9th of September, but if you ordered one of the special editions, you could play the game an entire weekend earlier. Now, I don't like this at all. I just wish that publishers and studios would stop doing this, because there's evidently not a good reason to do it anymore. You could explain it when it came to early access titles and games that weren't completely finished and that had a strong fan base of supporters that wanted to essentially beta test the game, but that's not a good excuse anymore, I feel, and I think that this type of behavior just needs to stop, because what you're essentially just doing is that you're just gating people from playing the game when it's already finished, just so you can get more money out of them. And again, the developers have done a really fine job with this game, but it's one of those things that always makes me want to remove 1 point out of my score, because I feel like this is just consumer unfriendliness. And aside from predatory microtransactions, I think this is another one of those things that just needs to go away because it's just not an okay thing to do. Now, obviously, Space Marine 2 is not the first game to do this. They're obviously not going to be the last. This is unfortunately just what basically every studio and publisher does nowadays to cash in more money. I don't know, I don't like it. But I do like Space Marine 2 very much. I would absolutely recommend anyone who hasn't played Space Marines or does not have an interest in Warhammer 40k, definitely check this out if you're into shooters, if you like co-op games. And obviously, I'm not the only one who feels this way, because if we head over to IGN, they actually reported that the top amount of players on Steam at one point was 225,690 players. Only on Steam. Now that's pretty huge. Now, since the actual release date, the all-time peak was 98,331. So obviously less, so they obviously managed to cash in on a lot of people by releasing earlier during the weekend, but still, just looking at the Steam stats for this, it's obviously a massive success. Now, I can't say what the numbers are for PlayStation or Xbox, we simply don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me that the official amount of players was probably closer to 1 million players at the same time if we just put 2 and 2 together, or maybe 600,000 or 700,000. I'm just guessing here, but it's probably much more than what we saw on Steam. And if we head on over to Metacritic, the game currently has a score of 83. So that's really good for a game that is mostly just a hack and slash shooter co-op game about big beefy Marines killing aliens and heretic scum. Again, I can absolutely recommend this game for anybody who has not been interested in 40k before. And let me know what you guys think about Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 in the comments below. And as always, have a great day. Mr. Olton, signing out.